Hey, it's Art from my new microphone. Let's discuss 11 common mixing mistakes that beginners make and how to solve them in the mix. I've personally been guilty of all of these mistakes throughout my mixing career, and I thought it would be valuable to share my experience with them, as well as more information on these common mistakes in this video. So let's get to it. Common mixing mistake number one I have for you is having too much sub-bass and bass energy in the overall frequency content of the mix. When we're first learning about mixing and sound and audio, we generally come across the fact that the universally accepted human range of hearing is between 20 Hz and 20,000 Hz. From this, we may assume that the bass energy resides way down near 20 Hz, while the treble energy resides upward toward 20,000 Hz. So if we want more bass, we can just boost down there in the extreme low end, and voila, we will have more bass. But that's not exactly how it works, and the extreme low end is mostly made up of rumble and noise that doesn't really add musically to the mix. Of course, there are some kick drums and bass elements that will produce sound frequencies down in the extreme low end, but even then, it can sometimes be beneficial to reduce the levels of these frequencies to get a better mix. So I made this mistake for years, thinking that boosting the extreme low end would give me more bass in the mix, when in reality, it just ate up headroom and made for a muddy mess of my mixes. It wasn't until I realized that the real bass frequencies of the mix range from 40 to 60 to about 120 Hertz that I really started getting the bass that I wanted in my mix. And from there, I learned that most of the power of the mix comes from the low mids, from about 120 Hertz to 500 Hertz. Now, many of us in home or bedroom studios like myself don't have the proper monitoring to really get an accurate picture of the low end of our mixes. So the best way I've found to test whether there's too much sub-bass or bass in my mixes is to reference them against commercially released tracks that have the bass under control within the mix. If you find that when referencing your mix against a commercially released track in a similar genre, that your mix has significantly more low end, you'll likely want to bring this down to get more so in the ballpark of the commercially released track. Doing so will afford your mix a bit more headroom so that you can get a louder and more clear mix. It'll help add a little bit more punch as there's less mud in the low end, and it will improve the overall frequency content of your mix. Furthermore, on the topic of the power coming from the low-mid energy in the mix, we're often taught early on to cut a lot of those frequencies to reduce the muddiness of the mix. While it's true that significant buildup in this low-mid range will cause a muddy mix, we need to draw a fine line and not cut everything in this range in order to have more power within the mix. So to get a stronger, punchier, and more powerful low end, consider boosting around the fundamental of the bass element. That could be the kick, the bass guitar, a bass synth, what have you, and pay attention to what's happening in the low mid range between about 120 to 500 Hertz and how boosting or cutting within this range can improve the punch and clarity of that instrument within the mix while also not making the mix overly muddy. We can also even look at high passing these bass elements at certain frequencies below their fundamental to help clean up a bit of that noise and rumble in the low end. And one more tip to improve the overall presence and power of bass elements within the mix is to utilize saturation to bring out a little bit of that mid-range content and make them more present, especially on smaller speakers and those playback systems that aren't able to produce the low end that we're after. Common beginner mixing mistake number two is having an inconsistent workflow or a lack of a workflow altogether. An inconsistent workflow or a lack of a workflow is a real time killer when it comes to mixing, especially when we are first starting out. There is so much to learn and to know when it comes to mixing that not having a proper workflow to walk you through the step-by-steps of the mixing process can really get us lost when we aren't sure exactly what to do with what we are mixing. On the flip side, having a strong and consistent workflow can help us go through the mix in a systematic fashion, reducing our decision fatigue and helping us get through the mix that much faster. Developing your own mix templates can help tremendously with that. As a Logic Pro user, I use mix templates all the time, and I actually have a template that you can check out for free in the description box down below. Mixing is definitely a creative process, but we should be keeping our creativity for the mixing itself and not wasting our time and energy in the minutiae of an unorganized or chaotic session. My typical workflow as of the recording of this video can be broken down into the following 5 steps. Preparing, organizing, and routing the session, getting the initial balance with faders and pan pots, doing the bulk of the mix with processes and effects, using automation and special effects to really sweeten the mix, and finally, finalizing the mix for the client and for myself. If you'd like to learn more about this workflow in detail, you can check out my free mixing guidebook. It will be the first link in the description box down below. You can click that, sign up to my newsletter, and I will send that to you right away. Common beginner mixing mistake number 3 is not utilizing effects returns for our reverbs and delays. Now, if we're unfamiliar with the various routing options that are available to us within our digital audio workstations, we may assume that the only way to get a delay or reverb into the session is to insert it directly on the track that we want to affect, and then to adjust the dry and wet controls from there. However, it's far more efficient to set up an effects return and to send audio from our tracks to that auxiliary effects return, and then insert our reverb or delay on the effects return itself. There are several benefits worth mentioning about this way of setting up our delay and reverb. The first of which is that we can send multiple tracks to a single effect, thereby reducing our plugin count or processor count within the mix. We also have independent control over the effects returns. This means that we can automate the level or the parameters of the reverb or delay without affecting the dry signals themselves, as well as being able to automate the send amount or the amount that the audio tracks are being sent to the reverb or delay effects returns. Additionally, we can add other inserts to the delay or reverb effects returns to affect just the delay or reverb and leave the dry tracks alone. In other words, we can EQ, compress, or saturate the reverb or delay without affecting the dry signals whatsoever, which would not be possible if we were inserting the delay or reverb directly on the tracks that we wanted to affect. If any of this is a bit confusing, I would encourage you to check out my full guide to routing in digital audio workstations, particularly in Logic Pro. I will leave a link to that video in the description box down below for more information. Common mixing mistake number 4 is focusing on the advanced techniques rather than on the fundamentals. There are plenty of tutorials here on YouTube that deal with advanced mixing concepts and techniques. However, if we don't have a strong sense of the fundamentals, we'll have a hard time getting mixes that really translate and fulfill us in our mixing endeavors. I was very guilty of this when I first started out, thinking that, oh, the fundamentals are too basic, too simple. That's not what's going to make my music sound good. I need these advanced techniques to really get me where I need to go. However, now that I have a bit more experience in mixing, I found that the fundamentals really carry the majority of the mix, and advanced techniques are really only necessary to fix issues or to add that extra 1 to 2% to the mix. So focus on your balance of levels of frequency content and of the stereo space within the mix. Use the basics of EQ, compression, saturation, delay, and reverb, and you'll get 80 or more % of your mixing results just from doing that. If you'd like to read more about all of these processes, I have my Mixing With series of ebooks that I'll leave a link to in the description box down below that goes through all of the most fundamental information in all of these processes and more, as well as touching on a few advanced concepts if you're so inclined. Common mixing mistake number 5 is mixing in solo. Now, when we are first starting out, it can be tempting to try to make every single track in our mix sound perfect on its own, believing that if we can do that, then they will all sound perfect when they are summed together. However, the whole art of mixing is about summing together multiple imperfect tracks into an ideal mix. We can spend a lot of time processing a track in solo to the point where we believe it's perfect, only to have it not fit within the mix whatsoever. Remember that every track has to come together cohesively in the greater context of the mix, and so we shouldn't spend too much time, if at all, mixing in solo. Unless it's about precise pinpointing and solving of issues within that single track, we should likely avoid mixing in solo. Common beginner mixing mistake number 6 is using too much reverb and other effects in the mix. When learning about reverb and delay and other effects, we can get really excited about using them and perhaps push them a bit too loud or too far within the context of the mix. Nothing says amateur mix quite like too much reverb that washes out the tracks that it is affecting and even the tracks that it is not affecting in the mix. So when starting out with reverb in the mix, it can be an invaluable practice to mix that reverb so that it is felt as a sense of space within the mix, without the reverb drawing any attention to itself. Do this over a few mixes and you'll find that you'll be able to better use reverb for a sense of space without washing out the elements in your mix, thereby making your mixes sound that much closer to a professional standard. If you're finding this video useful thus far and you believe that this information will be valuable to other beginner mixers, I would invite you to hit that like button. It really helps with the reach of this channel to get this information out to more people. Thank you. Common beginner mixing mistake number 7 is looking for offensive frequencies to cut. Now, we've all seen this technique of using a parametric EQ, boosting a very narrow band frequency and sweeping it across the frequency spectrum to look for an offensive frequency that we need to cut. While this is an effective strategy for finding any resonances that we hear in a sound, we should never go about doing this if we don't hear any resonances in the first place. By boosting a narrow band and sweeping that across the frequency spectrum, pretty much every frequency that gets boosted will sound offensive to our ears, and we can quickly end up with a comb-like EQ filter that causes a whole bunch of phase issues in the mix and really destroys the audio that we worked so hard to record. So, much like life, don't go looking to be offended, and your mixes will be that much better because of it. Common beginner mixing mistake number 8 is not using saturation. Now, if you've been following me for a while, you'll know that I have my 5 go-to processes, including EQ, compression, delay, reverb, and saturation. Now, saturation is not often talked about nearly as much as these other 4. However, it's an invaluable process to master and use within your mixes. Saturation effectively combines soft knee compression with harmonic generation to add a sense of presence and warmth to the sounds that it affects. In the analog realm, each analog component will add a little bit of subtle saturation or distortion to the signal, which helps give us that analog sound. And in the digital realm, in our digital audio workstations, we can use plugins to achieve this same effect. Saturation can be used to our advantage in many different ways within the mix, including its ability to help glue things together, to increase the presence or perceived presence of a track, to add warmth or an analog style sound to a mix, and even to add significant distortion and special effects to the mix. So if you are a beginner mixer and you haven't been using saturation, I would highly recommend starting to do so now. Common beginner mixing mistake number 9 is relying solely on compression to try to control our dynamics. Yes, compression is a primary tool for controlling dynamics. Compressors are designed to compress the dynamic range of a signal by reducing the peak levels or the loudest parts of a signal relative to the quietest parts. However, they should not be the only tool that we use for adjusting the dynamic range of our tracks within the mix. A single compressor with static settings can really struggle to control or tame the dynamic range, particularly of very dynamic signals, if those signals are all over the place within the context of the mix. Adjusting clip gain and using volume automation can really give us the fine-tuning that we need to really hone in and tame the dynamics of any given track within the mix without having to rely solely on compression. So try a bit of volume automation either pre or post compression to really hone in and control the dynamics in a way that benefits the mix the most. I should add that many compressors are used for their sonic characteristics rather than strictly for their dynamic control. So while compression is a powerful and essential tool in mixing, we may not want to rely on it solely to control the dynamics of our mixes. Speaking of volume automation, this brings us to common beginner mixing mistake number 10, and that is not using automation whatsoever. Yes, we can get a great static mix with the use of EQ, compression, saturation, delay, and reverb, but without automation, we will be lacking that movement, excitement, and professional sound that we hear on professional records. Volume automation is by far the most common use of automation within the mix. We can bring up certain fills or embellishments or special moments within the mix. We can bring down the volume of certain elements in certain sections to allow other elements to shine in the forefront of the mix. We can also increase or decrease the overall volume of the mix depending on the sections of the song to really hone in on the long-term dynamics of the track. But we don't only have volume automation. In digital audio workstations, we can automate pretty much any parameter of any plugin that we see fit, as well as many of the controls within the digital audio workstation itself. So have some fun with automation in your mixes, not only in volume and panning, but also in the parameters of the plugins that you use to help give a bit of excitement, movement, and professionalism to your mixes. And common beginner mixing mistake number 11 is overprocessing the mix bus. Now, as we are learning how to mix, we often overdo the things that we are learning within our mixes, and this is also true of mix bus processing. We could watch a video on YouTube and figure out, hey, I can add plugins and processes on our mix bus and easily overdo it and destroy the mix that we are working on. Mix bus processing should be there to sweeten or enhance the mix rather than to do the mixing for us. Yes, I realize that top-down mixing is a thing and that many people set up their mix bus and then mix into it, but that is completely different than over-processing the mix unintentionally. So when we are using mix bus processing, we shouldn't use it to fix problems in the mix that we can fix within the individual tracks, subgroups, and effects returns. Personally, I found myself in the past struggling a lot with limiting on the mix bus as I tried to get my mixes to a loud and competitive level. I would spend all of this time trying to get a great mix, and then I would slap a limiter on the mix bus and completely suck all the life and dynamics out of my mix, leaving myself with a poor, distorted result. So if you are using limiting on your mix bus, I would suggest watching out for that low end, going back to tip 1, making sure that it's not too loud and eating up too much of your headroom. And I would also suggest doing your best to craft as much punchiness as you can within the mix itself before limiting. And while a little bit of mix bus EQ or compression can really help polish that mix and bring everything together, if you find yourself using drastic EQ or compression moves on the mix bus, the likelihood of there being issues within the mix that are worth addressing is very high, and you should go back to the individual tracks, subgroups, and effects returns to solve those issues first. All right, so those are my 11 common beginner mixing mistakes that you should be avoiding in your mixes. Once again, they are too much sub-bass and bass in the overall frequency content of the mix, having an inconsistent workflow or a lack of a workflow, not using effects returns for your reverbs and delay, focusing on advanced techniques rather than on the fundamentals, mixing in solo rather than in the context of the mix, using too much reverb and washing out the mix, looking for offensive frequencies that don't exist, not using saturation, relying solely on compression to control the dynamics of the mix, not using automation, and overprocessing the mix bus. A few bonus mistakes I have for you here that didn't quite make the top 11 include panning haphazardly rather than panning intentionally, not considering the phase relationships between tracks before mixing and during mixing, especially if we're using copious amounts of EQ. And this final one is somewhat controversial, but not gain staging. So what do you think about these 11 common mixing mistakes that beginners make? Are you making any of them yourself? Have you made them in the past? Are there more that should be added to this list? Let me know in the comments down below what you think. And if you'd like more content from me here on the Minor Microphone YouTube channel, I would invite you to hit that subscribe button and to also check out one of these videos up here in the top left or top right corner having to do with more mixing tips. So hit that subscribe button, click on one of these videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.